Chapter 23, page 163. In Berlin, the preparations for the Olympics had begun several years before. Back when Joe and Roger were first trying out for freshman bow, at first the leader of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, did not want to host the games at all. Almost everything about the idea, in fact, had offended him. The very heart of the Olympics ideal was that athletes of all nations and all races should come together and compete on equal terms. But Hitler and the Nazi Party believed that the Aryan people were superior to all others. The notions of Jews, blacks, and members of other races from around the world visiting his country was revolting to Hitler. Once he rose to power in 1933, however, his feelings about the Olympics began to change. Hitler had great plans for Germany. The country was devastated after its defeat in the First World War. The German economy had collapsed. The country's army had been outlawed. Now Hitler wanted his nation to rebuild its military might, reclaim the territory it lost in the past, and expand further across Europe and the world. He wanted the people he considered his race, the Aryan race, to reign supreme over all people. Yet he needed time to build up his strength. If other nations discovered his plans before he had a chance to rebuild, they could crush those plans. So he kept his goals secret. One of the chief advisors, Joseph Goebbels, convinced Hitler that hosting the Olympics would be an ideal distraction. It would give the Nazis a chance to portray Germany as a civilized and modern state. The Olympics could be used to convince the world that Hitler governed a powerful but friendly nation, a country that the larger world would recognize and respect. As they put a show of peace and progress, the Nazis could quietly restore Germany's military might and prepare to conquer Europe. Once Hitler committed to the effort, the Olympics became a major public works project. Thousands of young German men transformed a 325-acre section outside of Berlin, the Reichssportfield, the site of the games. They constructed a great Olympic stadium large enough to hold 110,000 people. They built a swimming stadium, an equestrian stadium, a gymnasium, tennis courts, restaurants, and more. The buildings were built with natural German stone. The workers were all German too. To get jobs, Hitler decreed that they had to be registered citizens and members of the Aryan race. The Olympic rowing course lay 15 miles to the southeast in the leafy and pleasant lakeside community of Grünau. The rowing, canoeing, and kayaking events were all set to take place on the Langer See, one of several lakes fed by the Dame River. The Langer See, with its deep blue water, had long been the center of water sports in Berlin. In 1925, there were dozens of rowing clubs based in and around Grünau. Some were exclusively Jewish, some only Aryan, and some happily mixed. As the Olympics approached, however, all this changed. On September 15, 1935, Hitler stood before the leaders of the German government and announced 3 new laws. First, the Nazi Party emblem, the swastika, was to become the official flag of Germany. Second, only people of German or related blood could be citizens of Germany. The third law was aimed directly at Jews. Among other things, it has prohibited the marriage of Jews and non-Jews. In the next few months and years, Germany's government would add dozens of additional laws restricting every aspect of lives of German Jews, taking away their most basic freedoms. Across Germany, in towns and cities, signs proclaiming Juden Austern, Jews not welcome, appeared to be on the entrances of hotels, drugstores, public swimming pools, and shops of all sorts. Books written by Jewish authors and others the Nazis did not like were burned in public places. In Grünau, Jewish rowing clubs were banned. Other clubs were threatened if they did not kick out the Jewish rowers. Men who had rowed with one another for a lifetime began to turn their backs on their former crewmates and neighbors. Forbidding signs went up over the doors of shell houses. Doors were locked, keys changed. These frightening developments had not gone unnoticed outside of Germany. In the United States, there was a movement to boycott the 1936 Olympics in protest over the treatment of Jews in Germany. On November 21st, 1935, 10,000 anti-Nazi demonstrators marched peacefully through New York City, calling for America to stay home from the Games. In December, the Amateur Athletic Union of the United States voted on a new resolution. If the vote passed, the group would send a three-man committee to Germany to investigate claims that Nazis were mistreating Jews. But the vote failed. There would be no investigation. Boycott effort was effectively dead, and American athletes prepared to go to Berlin for the 1936 Olympics. After Princeton, the New York Athlete Club invited Ulbrichtson and the crew to use its training facilities in Traverse Island, an elegant spot on the nearby Long Island Sound. Cloud had a formal dining room, an oyster bar, a full-featured gymnasium, a boathouse, a baseball diamond, bowling alley, a barber shop, and every conceivable sort of athlete training equipment. The boys had easy access to excellent rowing water on the Sound. And best of all, the boys from the Field Forest and the small towns of Pacific Northwest. It was just a few miles from the glamour and excitement of New York City. The nation was in grip of the greatest heat wave in its history. But the boys did not let the sweltering he'd stop them from visiting major sites like Rockefeller Center and Wall Street. The source of the great stock market crash in 1929 that had begun the Great Depression. They rode the subway out to the beach on Coney Island. They made their way through the crowds on the boardwalk. They shoveled down 5-cent hot dogs at Nathan's, ate cotton candy, guzzled ice-cold Coca-Cola, gobbled peanuts, rode the hair-raising Cyclone roller coaster in Times Square one afternoon. And in Times Square one afternoon, a tall, somewhat heavy man rushed up to Shorty, took a good look, and said, "You're Shorty Hunt." He looked at the other boys. "You fellows are the Washington crew, aren't you?" He gushed that he had recognized Shorty from a picture in the newspaper. For the first time, the boys suddenly felt like celebrities, and something else began to draw on them. They were beginning to understand that they were not just the University of Washington crew anymore. They were America's crew. The W on their jerseys was about to be replaced with USA. They were rowing for something larger now. The fact struck Bobby Mark as he was sitting in the shade under a tree in a wide open field on Traverse Island. Opening an envelope from his father, the envelope contained a letter listing the addresses of the relatives he had hoped to visit in Europe as he had requested, but it also contained a second sealed envelope labeled "Read in a private place." Now alarmed, Mark opened the second envelope and read its contents. Gaston Mark told his son that when he met his relatives in Europe, he was going to learn for the first time that he was Jewish. Bobby sat under the tree, brooding for a long while. He was not upset that he was Jewish. He was bothered by the fact that his father had felt it necessary to conceal his heritage from his friends and his neighbors, and even his own children. Now Bobby was heading off to race a country that was gradually making it illegal even to be Jewish at all. For Joe, the moment of clarity came on the 86th floor of the new Empire State Building. None of the boys had ever ridden an elevator more than a few floors in a hotel. The rapid ascent to the 86th floor of the Empire State Building thrilled them nearly as much as the roller coaster out at Coney Island. Standing on the observation deck, Joe looked out at many spires in New York, rising through the smoke and steam and haze. He had never seen anything like it. He had not known whether he found it beautiful or frightening. He dropped a nickel in the telescope for a better view of the Brooklyn Bridge. Then he swept the telescope across lower Manhattan in the distant Statue of Liberty. In later days, he would be sailing under her on his way to Germany, a place where liberty was not given right. The headlines about the Nazis were impossible to ignore. Joe didn't know all the details, but he understood it. Liberty was under some kind of assault in Germany. For the first time, Joe had realized the boys would not just be rowing for gold, they would be rowing for a way of life, a shared set of values. Liberty was perhaps the most important of those values, but to the boys from Washington, America also stood for trust in one another, for mutual respect, for humanity, and for fair play. These ideals were part of what had drawn them together as a crew, and they were going to show the world the power of those ideals when they took in the water at Greenock. George Pocock spent the last few days before their departure for Germany carefully sanding down the hull of Husky Clipper, then applying a coat after coat of marine varnish, buffing each coat until the shell glistened. He wasn't doing it just for looks. The race in Berlin could come down to fractions of a second. He wanted the shell to have the fastest racing surface as possible. On July 13th, Pocock supervised the boys as they carefully loaded the 62-foot Husky Clipper onto a long truck and drove it through the heart of New York City with a police escort. They pulled up alongside the SS Manhattan, a 668-foot-long ship that would transport 334 members of the U.S. Olympic team to Germany, and search for a place to stow their shell. It took them an hour to figure out a way to hoist it up to the boat deck. Then they had tied it down, covered it with a tarp, and hoped and prayed that no one would ever mistake it for a bench. 2 days later, with the cameras rolling and the flashbulbs popping, the boys bounded up on the gangplank and onto the Manhattan at 10:30 in the morning. They were giddy, charged with excitement. After showing their gear and meeting with some of the other athletes, they joined hundreds of other waving American flags up on deck. As the noon departure approached, more than 10,000 spectators crowded onto the pier at the edge of the Hudson River. Blimps and airplanes circled overhead. Black smoke had begun to billow out of the red, white, and blue smokestacks of Manhattan. The crowd on the docks, waving for their hats over their heads, began to thunderous chants. "Ray, Ray, Ray, for the USA." The back struck up a tune. The lines were cast off. The Manhattan began to back slowly into the Hudson. Joe and the other boys rushed to the rails, waving their flags, taking up on the chant. The whistles on their tugs and the whistles on tugs and the ferries and nearby ships began to shriek. Out on the river, fireboats let loose their sirens and shot while the plumes of water high into the air. As the boat passed the Statue of Liberty and cruised out into the Atlantic, Joe stayed on deck. Leaning on the rail, enjoying the cool air, he was trying to remember everything so he could tell Joyce all about it when he returned home. Hours later, when the sun had begun to set in the west, Joe retreated into the ship, looking for the rest of the boys and food. The Manhattan, her lights ablaze and loud with music and laughter of young people at play, sailed forward, out into the darkness of the North Atlantic, on its way to Hitler's Germany.